The door had not been opened since 1958. What was inside stopped him breathing the moment it swung free. Inside that sealed room, something had been waiting for longer than most people stay anywhere. He was 71 years old and had spent 38 years building boats with his hands. When it was decided he could no longer stay in his own home, his daughter took the house. His son stood in a doorway and looked at the floor. They gave him one piece of paper before he left. A deed to a flooded boathouse at the edge of Pelham Cove that the county had seized for back taxes and assessed at $400. Rotting, half submerged. Standing in water no one wanted. He had $42 and a canvas bag. He took the morning bus to Dunhallow alone, and he walked down that gravel road and he opened that door. But I need to take you back to the beginning. Elroy Marsh had hands that told you everything about who he was, if you knew how to read them. The knuckles were wider than they should have been, shaped by decades of gripping tools in cold air. The palms were a map of every boat he had ever touched, every plank he had steamed and bent and fitted and fastened. He had spent 38 years at the marine yard on Pelham Cove, and before that, he had learned the trade the way men of his generation learned anything. Standing beside someone older and watching until his hands knew what his mind had not yet understood. His father had been a boat builder before him. His grandfather had caulked wooden hulls on the same stretch of coast where Elroy would one day work. It was not something he chose. It was something he was. He had grown up in Dunhallow on the harbour road, in a house that smelled of wood shavings and linseed oil because his father brought both home every evening in the fibres of his clothing. He had watched his father work on weekends in the shed behind the house, building a small dinghy over the course of 3 years, a project that moved in the rhythm of available hours rather than urgency, the kind of building that is also a form of thinking. His father had never finished it. Elroy did not know why. His father died when Elroy was 22, and the question was one of many that became permanent without an answer. He had carried it the way you carry questions about people who are gone, not with grief exactly, but with the particular weight of a door that stayed closed. He had married Lorette when he was 24. She was a practical woman who understood the noise a household makes around a working tradesman and had decided she could live happily inside that noise, which she did for 43 years, until the cancer made decisions of its own. They had raised 2 children in a house on Granger Road, and Elroy had built the back fence and the kitchen shelving and the window boxes that Lorette planted every spring. And he had thought, in the unexamined way a man thinks about things that seem permanent, that this was how it would continue. He retired 6 years ago when Lorette got sick because she needed him home, and he did not hesitate. He sold his tool belt and his bench plane and most of what he owned without sentimentality, because what mattered was inside the house and not in the workshop. Lorette died on a Tuesday in March, 3 years after his retirement, and the silence she left behind was the loudest thing Elroy had ever heard. He stayed in the house on Granger Road for 2 years after that. He kept it clean. He planted the same tomatoes Lorette had always grown along the south fence, because he found he could not face the south fence without them. He received his children when they came, which was less often than he would have liked, but often enough that he told himself things were all right. Deanna came 4 times that second year. She was 44, and she ran an insurance adjusting firm in the city, and she had a husband named Prentice, who always seemed to be standing just outside whatever room the actual conversation was happening in. Calvin was 39 and worked in road logistics and lived 3 hours north and called on Sundays, mostly, and sometimes did not call at all. Elroy did not chase either of them. He was not made for chasing. He cooked, he tended the tomatoes, he took long walks along the water in the early morning because the mornings were the hardest part, and walking through them was the only way he had found to survive them. The meeting happened on a Saturday in April. Deanna arrived with a folder, and Prentice parked the car and stayed in it, which told Elroy something. Calvin was there too, sitting at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface the way a man sits when he has already agreed to something and does not want to be asked about it again. Deanna explained it calmly. The property taxes on the house had become a burden. The upkeep was unsustainable. There was a buyer interested in the house, and the offer was fair, and the timing was right, and this was the responsible decision for everyone. For everyone was how she said it. She had a way of framing decisions so that the only unreasonable response to them was resistance, and she had clearly spent some time framing this one. Elroy sat at his own table and listened to his daughter explain why his home was being sold, and he watched the particular way Calvin's hands pressed flatter and flatter against the wood as the conversation went on, until they were almost part of the table, as if by pressing hard enough he could disappear into it entirely. That was the thing Elroy would remember, not Deanna's voice, which was reasonable and practiced, not the folder, which contained everything already signed that only needed his signature to be complete. Calvin's hands, pressing down, and Calvin's eyes fixed somewhere below the surface of the table, as if he had decided not to be present for what was being done. Elroy had known his son for 39 years. He knew that Calvin was not a cruel man. He knew that Calvin was a man who had learned early to accommodate the loudest voice in a room rather than the truest one, and that this habit had cost him something over the years that he had never fully named. He knew all of this, and it did not make the pressing hands any less of a wound. There was a storage unit paid for 3 months. There was a motel recommendation. There was the folder slid across the table with a pen resting on top of it. And then there was one more thing. Deanna reached into her bag and placed a second piece of paper beside the folder, a county deed transfer document, and she said the county had been looking to dispose of a waterfront property for back taxes, and she had arranged the transfer as a gesture of good faith, as an asset for Elroy to hold. She said it with the straightness of someone who has rehearsed the exact word for what they are doing and settled on asset. Elroy looked at the deed. Dunhallow, Pelham Cove. A boathouse structure identified as non-habitable. Assessed value, $400. She almost smiled when she said it. Not quite, but almost. He signed the folder. He stood up. He took the deed and put it in his shirt pocket. He did not say goodbye to Calvin because Calvin had not been present for any of it, and there was nothing to say goodbye to. The motel lasted 11 days. The math of survival at 71 on a fixed income is not complicated, and it is not kind. He had his Social Security coming, and he had what the storage unit did not take out of the small account Lorette had kept for emergencies, and neither amount was sufficient for anything except the temporary suspension of the immediate crisis, which is its own kind of cruelty. The storage unit held what was left of his life in labeled boxes, and he visited it twice in those 11 days, once to retrieve warmer clothing, and once simply because he needed to sit somewhere that held the smell of familiar things. Lorette's reading lamp was in there, a box of her cookbooks, the photograph from their wedding that had been on the mantel for so long its frame had left a ghost in the paint. He sat on a folding chair between those boxes for an hour on the second visit, and he did not cry, because he had already cried, and that part was done, but he let the weight of it sit on him for a while, which was different from crying, and equally necessary. The motel charged by the night. The rate was not low. He ate sparingly and walked to the water each morning because the habit was all he had left of the structure Lorette had given him, and he was not willing to lose it. On the 9th night, he took the deed out of his bag and unfolded it on the nightstand and read it twice. Non-habitable. Assessed at $400. He had a bus schedule on his phone. The fare to Dunhallow was $12. He had $42 left. He took the morning bus. The boathouse sat at the far end of a gravel access road off the Pelham Cove Harbour Road, and the first thing Elroy saw when he climbed down from the bus at the nearest stop and walked the quarter-mile to the water was the listing angle of the roof on the east side and the way the whole structure sat slightly lower than the dock, which meant water intrusion had been ongoing for some time. He stood at the end of the road and looked at it for a long time. A man who has built boats knows structures the way a surgeon knows a body. He does not see the surface only. He sees through it. He was looking at rotting lower boards on the north elevation, which was bad but not fatal. He was looking at the roof sag, which suggested rafter damage in a specific load-bearing section rather than general collapse, which meant it was addressable. He was looking at the foundation pilings, which were old-growth timber, which had survived the water precisely because old-growth timber was built to survive it. And he was thinking about that when he noticed that the east half of the structure was above water and the west half was not, and that the east half, if you looked at it with the right kind of attention, had bones that were sound. He walked to the door. The padlock on the main entrance was rusted to the hasp but not fused. He found a length of angle iron in the gravel and worked it for 20 minutes, and the lock gave. The main floor was flooded to mid-shin in the west section and dry in the east, which confirmed what he had read from outside. The smell was deep water, old wood, and something underneath both of those things that he could not immediately name, but that was not rot. He stood in the dry section and turned slowly, reading the structure the way he had spent his whole working life reading structures, with the unhurried attention of someone who has nothing to prove and everything to understand. The roof rafter at the east peak was intact. The wall framing was mortise and tenon, old work, built by someone who knew what they were doing. The floor joists were wet but not soft. He knocked on them with his knuckle and listened to the sound. Solid. He stood there for a long time. And then he noticed the door at the back. It was set into the east wall, low, planked with what looked like the same old-growth timber as the pilings, with a hasp and a padlock that was not rusted but caked, the kind of caking that comes from layers of paint applied over decades, as if someone had sealed it deliberately and then kept sealing it. It had not been opened recently. It had not been opened in a very long time. He looked at it for a while. He put his hand flat against the planking and felt the solidity of it, the absolute unyieldingness, the sense that whatever was inside had been waiting with patience rather than abandonment. He did not open it that day. He did not have the right tool. He filed it in the place in his mind where problems waited for the right moment. He slept that first night on the dry section of the floor with his canvas bag as a pillow and his jacket over him and the sound of the water underneath him. And he was not comfortable, and he was not warm, and he lay in the dark and listened to the building around him making its small settling sounds. He thought about Lorette, who had never been afraid of anything she could understand, and he thought about his father, who had taught him that every structure tells you what it needs if you are quiet enough to listen. He reached into his jacket pocket and found what he had been carrying for 3 weeks without looking at it directly. A small folded square of paper, worn at the creases, which had been in Lorette's bedside drawer when she died. He had not opened it since the hospital. He was not ready to open it tonight. He held it in his hand in the dark, and that was enough. Then he folded it back into his pocket and went to sleep. He was up before the light. He was stiff from the floor and the cold, and he stood on the dock in the grey early air and looked at the water and made his list. He needed to pump out the west section. He needed materials for the roof repair. He needed tools. Most of what he had was in storage. He would need to find a way to get it here, or he would need to find a way to acquire what he could not retrieve. He had $30. He had a deed. He had 38 years of knowledge that lived in his hands and his eyes and the quiet reading skill he had never lost. He walked the length of the dock in the morning air. And he did not think about Granger Road, and he did not think about the folder with Calvin's hands pressed flat against the table beside it. He thought about the roof pitch and the rafter load and the geometry of old-growth timber and what could be done. The Corrigan Marine Supply Store was a 20-minute walk along the harbor road. The sign above the door was the same sign that had been there when Elroy was 26 and first arrived in Dunhallow to work, which meant the current Corrigan was probably the son of the man Elroy had known. The man behind the counter was younger than Elroy by about 15 years, and he had the look of someone who had grown up in a marine supply store, a specific kind of unhurried competence that comes from a childhood spent among cleats and line and the particular smell of teak oil. He introduced himself as Nate. He said the store had been his family's for 2 generations. Elroy told him he had acquired the boathouse at the end of the Cove Road, and he intended to make it habitable, and he needed to talk through materials. Nate looked at him the way hardware men look at people who come in claiming to need serious materials, with the careful attention of someone deciding whether the claim is real. Then Elroy picked up a length of marine-grade white oak from the sample rack beside the counter, just to look at it, just as a habit of the hands, and he turned it in his fingers and ran his thumb along the grain and said nothing. Nate watched him do it. He watched the way Elroy's thumb moved, the way his fingers found the grain without searching for it, the complete absence of performance in the gesture, the flatness of certainty. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been working with marine oak?" Elroy said 38 years. Nate looked at the oak in Elroy's hands, and then he looked at Elroy's hands and he said, "Pick out what you need and we can work out the terms after." That was how it started. He began with the pump, borrowed from the harbor maintenance shed with permission from the harbor master, a man named Dell who was 73 and curious and who showed up at the boathouse 3 days later with a bag lunch and a willingness to pass tools and say nothing while Elroy worked, which was exactly the kind of company Elroy understood. The west section drained in 2 days. The smell that was left behind was mud and old diesel and the particular mineral smell of disturbed harbor floor, and it was unpleasant, but it was honest, and Elroy walked across the wet boards in his work boots and assessed what the water had hidden. The lower planking on the west wall would have to come out. The floor joists in the west section were soft and would need sistering. The north elevation boards he had seen from outside were exactly as bad as they had looked and would need full replacement. He made his list. He put numbers to it. He carried it in his head the way he had always carried structural problems, as a set of relationships rather than a collection of tasks, understanding how each repair enabled the next one. The east roof section took 4 days. He worked it alone mostly, with Dell handing materials up when asked, and on the afternoon of the 4th day, he stood on the repaired rafter with his weight distributed the way a man stands when he is testing something he has built, feeling for the give that is not there, listening for the creak that does not come. The sound beneath him was the sound of something restored, and he felt it move through his boots and up through his legs, and he stood there for a moment with his eyes closed and let himself feel it. Then he came down off the roof at dusk, and Myrtle Oakes was standing at the end of the dock with 2 cups of coffee. She was 82, she explained, in the way people state facts about themselves that have become irrelevant through repetition. She lived in the last cottage on the harbor road, the one with the green shutters. She had watched the lights in the boathouse for 4 nights, and she had decided that whoever was working in there at that hour was either desperate or determined, and either way they probably needed coffee. She handed him a cup and looked up at the repaired roof section and said, "It sat level for 20 years before the east side went." And Elroy looked at her and she said, "My husband built this dock, he and a man named Marsh, who was the best boat builder on this stretch of coast." Elroy stood still for a moment. He said, "Marsh was my father." Myrtle looked at him for a long time. She said, "I thought you looked like him." She handed him the second cup and sat down on the dock with her legs hanging over the edge, and they watched the water and said nothing more that evening. And that was how Myrtle became the first person in Dunhallow who knew who Elroy was and what he was doing. She came back every morning after that. She did not stay all day. She came in the early light with coffee and sat on the dock for an hour and then went home. And in the evening she came back with food that she said was more than she needed, which was true because she lived alone and had for 11 years since her husband died, and the last of the people she had loved in this town went with him. She did not ask Elroy for anything in exchange for the coffee or the food. She did not make the gift something he needed to be grateful for. She simply appeared and stayed and went, with the reliability of someone who has decided that consistency is the only form of care that matters now, and Elroy understood this because it was exactly the kind of person he was too. Jesse arrived 2 weeks later. He appeared at the edge of the dock one morning, a boy of 16 with a hollow look in his face that Elroy recognized, not as hunger exactly, but as the specific exhaustion of someone who has been making every decision alone for too long. He had been sleeping under the boat ramp awning half a mile down the harbor road for 3 days, he said, in the tone of someone who expects to be told to leave. He asked if there was work. Elroy looked at him for a moment. He said, "I have a dry floor and a task if you want both." Jesse said yes. He did not ask about money or a bed or any arrangement beyond that, as if he had learned not to ask about things that might be taken away. Elroy showed him the floor and the task, which was sanding the interior planking in the section of east wall that had dried out, and Jesse picked up the block and began. And he was not afraid of the work, and he was not tentative about it. That was the first thing Elroy noticed. The second thing he noticed was that the boy moved around the space the way someone moves around a familiar place, not a learned place, but a grown-up inside it place. He navigated the workbench without being shown where it was. He held tools by the right end. He stepped around the sawhorses without looking at them. Elroy watched this without comment and went back to his own work. He asked Jesse that evening where he was from. Jesse said north of here. He said his mother's people had fished out of Pelham Cove 2 generations back. He said he had not been able to stay where he was, and he did not say more than that, and Elroy did not ask more than that. He told the boy there was a sleeping bag in the east corner and the floor was dry, and it was his if he wanted it. Jesse looked at the corner and then back at Elroy and nodded once, and that was the extent of the negotiation, and from the following morning there were 2 people working in the boathouse before the light came up. Myrtle brought an extra cup with no explanation the morning after Jesse arrived, as if she had known he was coming, which she had not, but which was the kind of thing Myrtle did, arriving with exactly what was needed a day before anyone asked for it. On a Thursday 3 weeks after Jesse arrived, Elroy finally addressed the sealed door. He had the right tools now. He had a cold chisel and a mallet and the patience for it. He worked the paint seal off the hasp for 40 minutes while Jesse sanded behind him and the morning light came through the east window in long flat angles across the floor. The hasp came free. He lifted the iron ring and pulled. The door opened inward, slowly, with the sound of a seal breaking, air that had been still for a very long time, moving for the first time in decades. Elroy held the door and stood in the opening and looked at what was inside. The room was maybe 12 feet by 14. Dry, because the east wall had held. The air was old and close, the smell of sawdust and linseed oil and something beneath both. The specific warm smell of worked wood in an enclosed space. On a low workbench against the back wall, tools were laid out in the order they had last been used. A caulking mallet. A set of chisels in graduating sizes, each one in its place. A folding rule. A marking gauge. A spokeshave. And in the center of the room, resting on 2 low sawhorses, a wooden dinghy in the late stages of construction. Planked on both sides except for the last strake on the port side. One plank resting against the far wall, already shaped and fitted, waiting to be fastened, as if whoever had been building it had simply stepped out for a moment and not come back. Elroy stepped inside. He put his hand on the hull. The wood was sound. Marine oak, tight-grained, fitted with the evenness of someone who had spent a lifetime fitting wood. He ran his hand along the seam where the last completed strake met the gap for the final plank. The fit was perfect. He stood there in the stillness of the room and the sound from outside. The water, the gulls, Jesse sanding, all of it fell away. He was standing in his father's workshop. He recognized the chisels. He recognized the mallet handle, worn to a particular shape in a particular place that he had watched be worn as a child, watching hands just like his own, working on a hull just like this one. He reached to the workbench. Beside the caulking mallet was a small cloth-bound book, a ship's log his father had used to record materials and tides and weather. He opened it. The last entry was dated August of 1958. Materials received, weather clear. Work suspended, And tucked inside the back cover, folded precisely, a hand-drawn tide chart for Pelham Cove, drawn in his father's particular drafting hand, every current noted, every depth marked. In the margin, in pencil, in letters that were smaller than the rest, his father had written, "For Elroy when he's ready." He stood in that room for a long time. Jesse appeared in the doorway eventually. He looked at the dinghy, and then at the room, and then at Elroy. And Elroy held up the tide chart and said, "My father built this one. He never finished it." Jesse looked at the boat for a moment. He said, "The last plank's already cut." Elroy looked at it leaning against the wall. He said, "I know." He folded the tide chart and placed it inside the front cover of the log and set the log on the corner of the bench. And they stood there together in the old room in the smell of worked wood. And neither of them said anything more about it because there was nothing more to say about it yet. If you have made it this far into Elroy's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The boathouse had been registered as a non-habitable structure, and the county code's office had been aware of its change of occupancy for 6 weeks when the notice arrived. A municipal inspector would visit in 14 days if the structure did not meet basic habitation and structural standards. At the time of inspection, it would be condemned and cleared. Dell from the harbor maintenance shed read the notice over Elroy's shoulder and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, 14 days is enough. Elroy looked at him. Dell said, "If we start tomorrow." Nate Corrigan showed up that evening with 3 sheets of marine plywood and his son, who was 22 and strong and quiet, in the way young men are quiet when they have been raised, to let their work speak for them. Myrtle brought food and stayed to direct, which was the most efficient use of her available skills, and she was not wrong in her assessments, which Nate acknowledged with a nod on the second day when her suggestion about the north wall bracing turned out to be exactly right. Jesse worked every hour he was not asleep, because the boathouse was the only dry place he had, and he was not going to lose it without a fight. They worked in shifts. The floor came up in sections, and the soft joists were sistered, and the floor went back down. The north wall planking was stripped and replaced with new boards that Nate supplied at cost, because he said he wanted to see the job done right, and the margin was not the point. Dell knew a man who had a load of salvage framing lumber he was looking to move, and they got it cheap and used it on the west interior wall. The work moved fast when several people are doing the right thing at the right time and everyone understands which task enables the next one, which is the natural rhythm of a well-run build. It was during the second day of the push, in the afternoon, when the light was low and amber and everyone was working in focused silence, that Elroy looked up from the section of subfloor he was laying and saw Jesse at the bench in the sealed room, which Elroy had left open since the discovery. Jesse had found one of the old planes from the tool roll, a small shoulder plane that had been his grandfather's before it was his father's, and he was drawing it along the edge of a piece of scrap oak with the kind of unhurried authority that is not technique but instinct, the kind of movement that comes from having grown up around this in some earlier life that no longer exists. He was not showing off. He did not know he was being watched. He was just doing it. The shaving curled off the oak in one continuous ribbon, and Jesse looked at it and set the plane down and picked up the wood to check the edge, and he felt it with the same flat certainty of thumb that Elroy used, with no awareness of using it, the gesture of someone for whom wood is simply a language. Elroy watched this for a long moment. He set down his own tools and he stayed very still. The boy had not been taught this. There was no teacher here. It was in his hands, the way things are in hands when they have been passed down through blood rather than instruction, a knowing that lives below the level of learning. His mother's people had built boats on this cove 2 generations back. Whatever had been in those hands was in Jesse's hands too, waiting for the right tool in the right room in the right silence. Elroy thought of his own hands at 16, in his father's shed, picking up a block plane for the first time and feeling it fit his grip as if it had been waiting there. He thought of his father watching him from across the shed and not saying anything, because there was nothing to say that the hands did not already know. He set down his tools. He said nothing. Jesse turned and saw him and said nothing either. Elroy picked his tools back up and went back to the subfloor. Jesse set the plane back in its place on the bench. They did not talk about it. They did not need to. The flooring was in by day 9. The wall repairs were complete by day 11. On day 12, Elroy climbed up and checked the roof repair he had done in the first week, and it was exactly what it had been. Sound. The morning of day 14, the boathouse smelled of sawdust and linseed oil and fresh-cut wood, and every surface was clean, and Dell was on the dock with his bag lunch, and Myrtle was in the east corner with coffee, and Jesse was at the bench doing nothing in particular except being present, and Nate Corrigan was standing at the door because he wanted to see. The inspector arrived at 9 in the morning. He walked every inch of the structure with his clipboard and his measuring tape and his expression of habitual skepticism, and his expression changed in small visible increments as he walked. He crouched and knocked on the subfloor joists the way Elroy had knocked on them the first morning, listening for the sound. He looked up at the repaired roof section and looked at it for a long time. He came to the door of the sealed room and looked at the dinghy on its sawhorses and the tools laid out in the light coming in through the east window across the old oak hull, and he stood there for a moment without writing anything. Then he said, "Whoever built this space originally knew what they were doing." Elroy said yes. The inspector wrote something on his clipboard. He said, "And whoever repaired it knew what they were doing too." He stamped the form and handed Elroy the copy and said, "You have a sound building, Mr. Marsh?" Elroy held the paper. Myrtle raised her cup. Dell said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved. Nate Corrigan looked at the floor and then at the ceiling and then at Elroy and said, "I knew it." Jesse was already back at the bench. 3 days after the inspection passed, Elroy also allowed himself to do one thing he had been holding in reserve. He opened the ship's log to the first page, to the tide chart his father had tucked there, and he read his name in the margin again in the pencil that had been waiting since 1958. And then he picked up a pencil of his own and turned to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. He wrote, "Work recommenced." He wrote the materials on hand. He wrote the weather. He set the log back on the corner of the bench beside the last plank, where his father had left it, and he went back to work. It was a small thing. It was the whole thing. The story ran in the Dunhallow Courier 3 weeks after the inspection. A reporter named Wanda had heard about the inspection outcome from the harbour master's office, which hears everything eventually, and she had come down to the cove and asked if she could write about what Elroy had built. Elroy said she could write about the building, but he would prefer she left the family history to one side. She wrote about the building. She wrote about the dinghy and the sealed room and the tools laid out and the hand-drawn tide chart in the year 1958. She wrote about Jesse, with his permission, without specifics, as a young person who had found a flaw and a task and a direction. She wrote about Myrtle, who told her that this stretch of cove had been waiting for someone to pay attention to it again, and that she was glad she had lived long enough to see it. The story ran on page 1. The Regional Wire picked it up 2 days later. The County Arts and Heritage Board called. The Harbour Commission called. Elroy did not return most of the calls. Nate took some of them on his behalf and reported back each evening. There were inquiries about the dinghy, whether it would be completed, whether it would be exhibited. Elroy did not answer those inquiries. The dinghy was not for exhibiting. It was for finishing, in the right time, in the right way, and no one else had a say in that. 4 weeks after the Courier piece, at the annual Dunhallow Harbour Stewardship Ceremony, the Town Council presented Elroy Marsh with the Community Stewardship Award for the preservation and restoration of a historic working structure on Pelham Cove, the first such award in 11 years. Dell was in the front row in a clean shirt. Jesse sat beside Myrtle in the second row, and Myrtle had her hand on top of his on the armrest, and he let it stay there. Nate Corrigan was near the back, where he had stood at every community event for 20 years, because he liked to be able to see the whole room. Elroy stood at the small podium with the plaque in his hands, and he said, "Thank you," and nothing else, because he had never been a man for speeches, and he was not going to start now. and the people in the room who knew him understood that the brevity was the speech. Deanna came on a Saturday in October, 6 weeks after the courier piece. She drove herself this time. She stood at the end of the dock for a moment before she came on to it, as if she was deciding something. She was dressed for the city rather than for the harbor, and she looked slightly out of place in the way that people look out of place when they have arrived somewhere that has become complete without them. She said the house had sold well. She said she had seen the newspaper article, and she was glad things had worked out. She looked at the Boathouse and said it was really something, what he had done with it. She said she had been thinking that perhaps there was a way to make the arrangement more formal, the deed, the structure, some kind of family involvement. She said it in the way she said most things, with the practiced reasonableness of someone who has already decided the outcome and is presenting the path to it as an obvious one. Elroy noticed she did not ask about the building. She did not ask about Jessie or Myrtle or what had been built here that could not be found in the Courier article. She asked about the deed and the structure because those were the things that had a value she could read. Elroy let her finish. He said, "You gave me a flooded building assessed at $400 and told me it was an asset. You signed papers on my house while your brother looked at the table, and you almost smiled when you handed me the deed." He said it without cruelty and without performance, the way a man states the coordinates of a place so that both people in the conversation know exactly where they are. He said, "I do not need anything from that arrangement formalized. What I built here, I built." He looked at her steadily. He said, "You can come and see it if you want. That is up to you. But there is nothing here that belongs to that conversation." Deanna looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at the Boathouse, and then back at him, and she said, "I understand." She walked back down the dock and got in her car and drove away. Elroy stood on the dock and watched the car until it was gone, and then he turned back to the water, which was the same water it had always been, and he stood there for a while, in the way a man stands when something that has been weighing on him for a long time has finally been set down. Calvin called on a Sunday, 2 weeks after that. He called in the evening, which was not his habit, and he sounded like a man who has been sitting with something for a long time and has finally decided to put it down. He did not explain himself immediately. He said he had seen the piece in the paper. He said he had looked at photographs of the Boathouse and he had recognized it because their father had talked about the Pelham Cove yard when they were small, and he had not connected that story to the deed Deanna had handed over until he saw the photographs and the name of the cove in the caption, and then he had sat with that for a while. He said he had been thinking about what he had done, or not done, and that he knew those were different things in this case, and he knew that knowing that was not the same as having done differently. He stopped. Elroy listened. He said, "I hear you, Calvin." There was a silence. Elroy said, "The door here is not locked." He said it without rushing it, without making it easy or making it hard. He meant it completely. Calvin said, "Thank you, Dad." Elroy said good night and put the phone down and sat for a while in the quiet of the east section with the water sounds underneath him. The tide chart was on the windowsill now. He had placed it there the evening after Calvin's call in the ship's log, open to the page where the chart was tucked, sitting on the sill where the morning light would find it. He had not moved it since. It faced outward, toward the cove, the way his father had always intended it to face. In November, a couple arrived at the dock in the early afternoon, a man and a woman in their late 60s, standing at the end of the access road with the look Elroy knew, the particular stillness of people who have run out of road and do not know yet what comes next. The woman was carrying a bag. The man had his hands in his pockets. They had heard about the Boathouse, they said, from someone who had read the Courier piece, and they did not have much, and they did not know what they were asking exactly, but they had not known where else to go. Elroy looked at them for a moment. He said, "Come in out of the cold." He said it the way he said everything, without ceremony, without the performance of generosity, as if it was simply the obvious next thing. Myrtle was at the bench when they came in, reading with her coffee. Jesse was on the dock in the low afternoon light, checking the cleats on the mooring lines he had spliced the previous week. The splice tight and even, the work of someone who had found his hands. The smell of the place was wood and coffee, and the salt air coming off the cove, and the couple stood inside the door and looked at what Elroy had built, and the woman said quietly, "This is real." Elroy said, "Yes, it is." He showed them the east corner. He gave them what he had. He did not make it a big thing, because the measure of a thing is not the size of the gesture, but whether it is given freely and without conditions, which it was. That evening he sat alone at the workbench with the dinghy on its sawhorses beside him, and the last plank still resting against the wall where it had been resting since 1958. And he took the tide chart out of the log and held it in his hands in the lamplight, and he read his name in the margin in his father's pencil, and he thought about what his father had known that he had not known yet when he wrote it. He thought about Jesse's hands on the shoulder plane in the amber light of the second afternoon, the shaving curling off in a single ribbon. He thought about Myrtle's hand resting on top of Jesse's arm in the second row of chairs at the stewardship ceremony, both of them belonging somewhere for perhaps the first time in a long time. He thought about the couple in the east corner who had come here because they had heard there was a place that did not require anything from you before it let you in. He thought about all of it for a while. Then he put the chart back in the log and set it on the corner of the bench, and he picked up the final plank and turned it in his hands in the old familiar way, reading the grain, reading the weight, reading the 67 years of patience in the wood. He set it against the hull. It fitted exactly the way it had always been going to fit, the way things fit when they have been built right from the beginning by someone who knew what they were doing. He reached for the mallet. He picked up the first fastening. He drove it home with 3 clean strokes, and the sound of it rang off the old walls and came back to him clean and true. He worked slowly and steadily through the evening, one fastening at a time, until the last plank was in, and the hull was whole, and the boathouse was quiet around him, and the water was dark outside the window, and the tide chart on the sill caught the lamplight and was still. He had not built the last one alone after all. I want to know how this story sat with you. Whatever you felt as you listened, whatever came up, share it in the comments below. There is no right or wrong answer. This is a place for all of it. And tell me where you are watching from today. I want to know how far this community reaches, what corner of the world brought you here tonight. And I have one more question, because this story keeps asking it of me. Has there been a skill or a craft or a gift in your family? Something passed down without being spoken about? Something that showed up in your hands before you understood where it came from? Tell me about that in the comments. I want to read everyone. Thank you for being here and for listening all the way through. The next story is coming soon, and I think it is going to stay with you.